Snow fell relentlessly, wrapping the world in a blanket of white silence. The ground was frozen, the air sharp as ice, and yet, in the middle of the desolation, a small, frail figure sat huddled beneath the jagged remains of an abandoned building. Her clothes, worn and tattered, barely offered warmth against the biting cold. A red sweater, threadbare and torn, clung to her thin body, while long, tangled brown hair framed her pale, tear-streaked face. She clutched a faded teddy bear to her chest, the fabric worn and frayed, as though it had been her only companion for years. Her wide eyes, full of sorrow and exhaustion, scanned the empty streets. She was alone, abandoned, yet there was an unspoken resolve in her tiny frame. She hadn't cried in hours, not since the snow had begun to fall. Instead, she whispered softly to the teddy bear, the words barely audible in the silence. "Please don't leave me. Please don't let them take me again." Out of the blizzard, a shadow moved, approaching slowly but purposefully. A soldier in his 40s, battle-worn and weary, stepped into the ruined alley where the girls sat. His camouflage uniform was dirty, and his face was hardened by years of war. His posture was stiff, but his eyes, though tired, softened when they fell on the child. Behind him, a loyal German shepherd canine moved silently through the snow, its eyes sharp, its body coiled in readiness. The dog's fur, matted with snow, shivered slightly in the cold, but it stayed close to the soldier, its ears flicking at every sound, every movement. The soldier stopped when he saw her, the small figure in the torn sweater, her eyes empty with the weariness of someone who had seen too much. The girl looked up, her gaze meeting his, and for a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the wind howling through the alley and the soft growl of the K9. "Why are you sleeping here, sweetheart?" the soldier asked gently, his voice low and calm, though his heart clenched at the sight of her. The girl blinked at him, her eyes clouded with confusion and fear. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she shifted slightly, her teddy bear held tightly in her arms. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice small, fragile, as if the world had already broken her once, and she feared it would again. The soldier's heart sank. He dropped to one knee, careful to show her he wasn't a threat. "I'm not going to hurt you," he reassured her. "I'm here to help." The K9, sensing the soldier's intention, sat beside him, its warm body a comforting presence against the cold. Before the soldier could speak again, the girl looked down at her teddy bear, her small hands trembling. "They're always looking for me," she whispered. "They want to take me away." "I don't want to go back." The soldier's eyes softened further. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, as much to reassure himself as her. "Who's looking for you?" She didn't answer, her gaze drifting back to the bear in her hands. For a long moment, the soldier just watched her, uncertain of what had brought her to this place. His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. She couldn't have been here long, too small, too fragile, but the look in her eyes told a different story. And then, as though the weight of the world was too much for her, the girl whispered, her voice so quiet it could have been lost to the wind. "Daddy's not dead. He said you'd come. He promised you'd come for me." The soldier froze. The words were a knife to the chest, a whisper of hope so fragile it could break with the slightest breeze. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. The image of her father, whoever he was, wherever he might be, rose in his mind, a man who had made a promise in the face of death, a man whose words had somehow found their way to this little girl, despite everything. Before we begin, let me know where you are watching from. Leave your country name in the comments below. And if you love stories about courage, loyalty, and community, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. The K9's growl cut through the moment, low and threatening. The soldier snapped to attention, his eyes scanning the alleyway. The snow fell heavier now, and shadows moved at the far end of the street. "They're coming," the soldier muttered to himself. His grip tightened on his rifle, but his mind was already on the girl. "Stay behind me," he said firmly to her, rising to his feet. "Don't move, do you hear me?" The girl nodded quickly, clutching her teddy bear even tighter. She backed away slowly, but her eyes never left him, as though she had found something in him she hadn't dared believe in. The canine growled again, its body tense, ready to spring. The soldier turned to the girl one last time. "Hold on tight to your bear. I won't let anyone take you." Just as the first figures appeared through the snowstorm, the girl whispered again, her voice barely audible. "Please, don't send me back." The soldier's heart clenched, but his resolve hardened. They wouldn't take her, not on his watch. The wind howled louder, and the night stretched on, filled with danger and fear. But in that moment, as the canine stood ready, the soldier's heart beat in rhythm with the girl's whispered plea, a promise made between them, one that would see them both through whatever came next. And as the first shots rang out, the soldier and his canine sprang into action, ready to face whatever the night brought. The first shot rang out, breaking the stillness of the night. The soldier moved in an instant, every muscle trained, his body reacting faster than his mind could process. He threw himself between the girl and the incoming threat, his rifle raised, scanning the shadows that emerged through the swirling snow. The canine was already on the move, a blur of motion, darting toward, the figures advancing through the snowstorm. The dog's growl was deep, predatory, but its loyalty to the soldier never wavered. The soldier's eyes were locked on the shapes ahead, 3 men, all armed, stepping cautiously through the thick snow. They were moving toward him with deliberate intent, their eyes cold, but their approach was slow, almost as if they were savoring the moment. Mark's heart raced. He knew they weren't alone anymore. He could feel the weight of their eyes, the heavy silence pressing in. The girl, Maya, was huddled behind the wreckage of the broken wall, clutching her teddy bear tightly to her chest. She was shaking, her eyes wide with fear, but she trusted him. He could feel it. The soldier took a deep breath, steadying his hands. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, not now. Maya's life depended on him. "Stay behind me," he murmured, more to himself than to her, his voice low but firm. But even as he spoke, the figures stepped into the light, their weapons raised. "You're surrounded, Sergeant," one of them called out, a deep, gravelly voice carrying through the snow. "There's no way out. Hand her over and we'll make it quick." Mark's fingers tightened on his rifle, but he didn't move. He couldn't afford to be hasty. These men weren't just thugs, they were professionals, and they had planned this. The canine's ears flattened, its growl low and steady. The dog didn't need orders to know what was at stake. Mark could feel its presence at his side, loyal and unwavering, ready to leap into action at the slightest signal. Maya's voice, small and quiet, drifted over the wind. "Are they going to take me too?" Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized she had heard them. Her eyes were wide with fear, her teddy bear pressed tight against her chest. "No," he whispered fiercely, his eyes meeting hers. "Not while I'm breathing. I won't let them take you." The man who had spoken earlier took a step forward, the barrel of his rifle glinting in the dim light. "You're outnumbered, Sergeant." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Mark's grip tightened around the rifle. The wind howled louder, as if urging him to act. He glanced back at Maya, her eyes, full of questions, full of trust. He couldn't let her down. Not now. With a sharp nod to Rex, he gave the signal. The canine lunged forward, faster than lightning, its jaws snapping around the arm of the first gunman, dragging him to the ground. The soldier moved in sync, his training kicking in as he fired once, twice. The second man dropped without a sound. The third, though, was faster, his own weapon raised, ready to strike. "Get down!" Mark shouted at Maya, pulling her into the safety of the shadows. The canine was already on the move again, barreling into the third gunman, but the man fired just as Rex collided with him, the bullet whizzing past Mark's ear. The soldier flinched, but didn't hesitate. His shot was true, and the third man fell, his rifle clattering to the ground. Breathing heavily, Mark looked around. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but he knew this was only temporary. Keen's men wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. Mark moved quickly, dropping to his knee beside Maya. "We need to go now." He grabbed her hand and pulled her to her feet, making sure she held tightly to her teddy bear. The K9 padded beside them, alert and watchful. They moved fast, weaving through the snow, heading toward the nearby woods where Mark had spotted a possible escape route. The snow was deep, and the cold cut through every layer of clothing. But Mark didn't feel it. His focus was razor-sharp. Maya's safety was all that mattered now. They reached the edge of the forest, the trees casting long shadows in the fading light. Mark paused, scanning their surroundings for any sign of movement. Rex was at the forefront, ears perked, eyes sharp. "Stay close," Mark whispered, his voice low but urgent. Maya clutched his hand tightly, her small fingers cold but steady. She didn't cry anymore, didn't ask questions. She simply followed him, trusting him completely. But as they moved deeper into the woods, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every step felt like it was echoing through the trees, every rustle of the wind carrying the threat of danger. And then, just as they reached a small clearing, Mark's worst fear was realized. A figure stepped out from behind a tree, a shadow in the snow. Keen, the man's presence was suffocating, his smile cold and calculating. He was alone, but that didn't make him any less dangerous. His gaze locked on Mark, then shifted to the little girl at his side. "You didn't listen, Sergeant," Keen said, his voice smooth, calm. "You made this harder than it had to be." Mark's fingers tightened on the rifle. "I told you," he growled. "I'm not giving her up." Keen tilted his head, a wicked smile curling on his lips. "Then we'll see just how far you're willing to go to protect her." And before Mark could react, Keen's voice cut through the air, sharper than a knife. "Get them." And just like that, the soldiers who had been trailing them emerged from the trees, surrounding them in the blink of an eye. Mark's heart raced. There was no way out, not this time. But as he looked down at Maya, her wide, tear-filled eyes searching his, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't giving up, not for anything, not even if it cost him everything. Before Keen could give the command to advance, Maya whispered, her voice breaking through the chaos. "Daddy's not dead, right?" Mark froze. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, the weight of them so heavy it nearly knocked the wind out of him. But he couldn't lie. "Not now." "Not dead," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I promise." And with that, he turned, ready to face whatever came next. The soldiers were closing in, their boots crunching in the deep snow as they surrounded Mark, Maya, and the newborn baby wrapped in a green blanket. Keen's calm voice echoed through the trees, steady and cold. "Surround them. Don't let them escape." Mark's mind raced. He could hear the faint sound of Maya's breathing, shaky and fast, the cold air catching in her throat. Her grip on his hand was tight, but he could feel her fear. It mirrored his own. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep them safe. "Stay close," he whispered to her, his voice low and urgent. He pulled her behind him, his rifle raised, his finger hovering over the trigger. The German Shepherd K9 growled at the approaching soldiers, its body tense, every muscle ready to spring into action. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. The situation was dire. They were outnumbered, and there was nowhere to run. They were trapped in the clearing, surrounded by trees with no real escape route in sight. "Don't move," Mark said, his voice strained. "Not unless I say—" The wind howled through the trees, the snow falling heavier, muffling every sound except for the crunch of boots in the snow. Mark could feel the cold creeping into his bones, but his focus was sharp. He couldn't afford to be distracted. "Not now." Maya's tiny voice broke through the storm. "Are we going to die, Mark?" The question hung in the air like a weight. Mark's chest tightened. He had no answer for her, no reassurance that would be enough. Not this time. He looked down at her, his heart aching. "No," he whispered. "We're not going to die." Not today, but even as he said the words, the reality of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. They were outmatched. Keen's men had them surrounded. The last vestiges of daylight were fading, the shadows growing longer, and soon they would have nowhere left to hide. Mark could feel the eyes of the soldiers on him, the weight of their guns aimed directly at him. He had no choice but to fight, to give Maya and the baby the chance to escape. "Now!" Mark said, his voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest. He didn't wait for the soldiers to react. He moved, fast and fluid, the K9 charging ahead with a vicious growl. He fired once, twice, each shot striking true. The first soldier fell to the snow, his rifle clattering to the ground. The second soldier hesitated, just long enough for Mark to fire again, knocking him off his feet. But there were too many. More men were advancing from every side. Mark fired again, but his ammo was running low. He needed a plan, fast. He glanced at Maya, her eyes wide with fear. The teddy bear still clutched tightly in her arms. She didn't deserve this. None of them did. "Get to the trees!" Mark shouted to Ruth, who had managed to stay hidden behind a snowbank. "Take the baby and go!" Ruth hesitated, her eyes filled with worry, but she nodded and grabbed the baby, cradling her close. "Come with us," she urged, her voice pleading. Mark shook his head. "You have to go now. I'll hold them off." The German Shepherd K9 darted forward, its teeth bared as it attacked the remaining soldiers, forcing them to retreat. Mark fired one more shot, taking down the last man in their immediate area. "Move!" he yelled. "Now!" Ruth didn't hesitate this time. She sprinted toward the trees, Maya following closely behind her, clutching her teddy bear. Mark stayed behind, his eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement, every muscle tense, ready to fight. But as they reached the cover of the trees, something changed. Maya stopped suddenly, her eyes wide with fear. She looked back at Mark, her lips trembling. "Daddy isn't dead, right?" she asked again, the words breaking through the chaos like a knife to Mark's heart. He froze. He hadn't expected her to ask again, hadn't expected her to hold on to that hope so fiercely. He didn't know how to answer. He didn't know what had happened to Maya's father, only that he had been a man willing to sacrifice everything for his daughter's safety. "Maya," Mark began, but he didn't know how to finish. His words caught in his throat. "I promised him," she said, her voice barely audible. "He said you'd come." Mark's heart twisted in his chest. This little girl, so strong despite everything, was holding on to the last piece of hope her father had given her. "I'll bring you to him," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'll bring you to him, I swear." He turned back toward the soldiers, his rifle raised again. But they had already retreated. The silence that followed felt suffocating, a brief lull in the chaos. Mark knew it wouldn't last. They were regrouping. Keen would not let them escape. The wind picked up, blowing the snow into their faces, and Mark moved quickly toward the trees, making sure Maya and Ruth were safe for the moment. But the question, the echo of Maya's plea, would haunt him. "Daddy's not dead, right?" He didn't have the answer. Not yet. The wind howled, a relentless force pushing against Mark and the others as they plunged deeper into the forest. Each step was more treacherous than the last, the snow thick and heavy beneath their boots. Mark's mind raced, but it wasn't the cold he was fighting. It was the gnawing fear that Keen's men were never far behind. Ruth was ahead, the baby still cradled in her arms, her eyes wide with panic, but determined. Maya, too, kept pace, her teddy bear clutched tightly, her face pale but filled with the fierce determination that only a child could carry. And Mark, though his body ached and his wounds throbbed, kept moving. He couldn't stop. Not until they were safe. And yet, as much as he wanted to believe they could outrun the storm, Mark knew the truth. Keen would follow. Keen always followed. Rex trotted beside them, his dark fur matted with snow, his eyes scanning the path ahead, alert to every sound, every movement in the trees. The dog's loyalty was unwavering, and it gave Mark a sense of security in a world where there was none. "We're close," Ruth said, her voice low but steady. "I can see the edge of the woods." "The river is just beyond. We can make it, Mark." He nodded, though his instincts screamed that they were being hunted. "We don't stop until we're across." Ruth glanced at him, her eyes filled with something between fear and hope. "What if they come after us?" Mark didn't look back as he spoke. "They will." "But we keep moving." Maya, who had been silent for a while, looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "What if they catch us, Mark?" The question hit him harder than he expected. How could he answer? How could he tell her that everything depended on chance? That sometimes survival wasn't a choice, it was a matter of luck, timing, and sheer willpower. "We won't let them catch us," he said firmly. He didn't want to lie, but he couldn't show weakness now. "We just keep running." As they neared the river, the snow seemed to intensify, the wind howling louder, carrying the promise of danger. Mark knew this was their last chance. If they didn't cross the river now, they would be trapped, cornered with no way out. He urged them forward, his heart pounding in his chest as they reached the water's edge. The river was wide, the current strong, and the ice that had formed along the banks was thin, dangerous. There was no way to cross without risking everything, but he had no choice. "We need to get across, fast," Mark said, his voice sharp with urgency. He looked at Ruth. "You first." "I'll follow." Ruth hesitated but nodded, then stepped onto the ice. It cracked under her weight, but she kept moving, her steps slow but steady. Mark held his breath, watching her every move until she reached the far bank. Only then did he allow himself to exhale. Maya was next, her small form moving cautiously across the ice. Mark's heart was in his throat as he watched her, every step a risk, but she made it, her tiny feet light on the fragile surface. She held her teddy bear close to her chest, eyes wide with fear, but also trust. Mark was about to follow when the sound of boots crunching in the snow stopped him dead in his tracks. "Don't even think about it, Sergeant." Keen's voice came from behind him, calm as ever, though the threat was clear in his tone. Mark turned slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but Keen was already there, flanked by two of his men. Their rifles were trained on him, but Keen didn't raise his. He simply watched Mark, his smile cold and predatory. "You can't outrun me," Keen said, his voice almost amused. "You know that, right?" Mark kept his gaze locked on Keen, his body tense, every muscle primed to fight. "I'm not running," he said. "I'm just trying to keep them safe." Keen raised an eyebrow. "You think you can protect them from me?" "You're not even sure if you'll make it out alive, Sergeant. You don't have the strength to keep this up." Mark didn't flinch. "I've survived worse." Keen chuckled, his eyes dark and calculating. "We both know that's not true. You're tired, you're wounded, you've been running for days, you're running out of time." Mark's grip on his rifle tightened. "I'll die before I let you touch them." Keen's expression shifted, his smile faltering for just a moment. "You're a fool, Sergeant." "You think that means something to me? You're just another casualty in my plan." With that, Keen motioned to his men. The two soldiers stepped forward, rifles raised, but before they could fire, Mark made his move. He lunged, dropping to the ground and rolling to the side, narrowly avoiding the shots aimed at him. The K9 was already on the move, a blur of fur and muscle, lunging at the nearest soldier. Mark grabbed Maya's arm and pulled her toward the edge of the river, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't afford to stop now. "Go!" he shouted at Ruth, who was frozen in place, watching the chaos unfold. "Get across now!" Ruth didn't hesitate. She sprinted across the remaining ice, the baby still cradled in her arms. Mark followed, keeping Maya close to him, his rifle ready as the soldiers advanced. He could hear Keen's voice behind him, low and mocking. "You won't win this, Sergeant." "You never will." But Mark didn't listen to him. He focused only on getting Maya to safety, on crossing that last stretch of ice. Just as they reached the far bank, Mark glanced back one last time. Keen's men were still coming, but they were too far behind. They were safe, for now. The cold hit him like a wall, but he didn't care. He had them. Mark set Maya down, his hands shaking from the effort, his breath coming in gasps. He looked at Ruth, who had already found shelter beneath a nearby tree, the baby wrapped in the green blanket, sleeping peacefully. But Maya's eyes were wide, searching. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling, "Daddy's not dead, right?" Mark froze. How could he answer her? How could he explain the uncertainty that gnawed at him? He could only offer her a small, reassuring smile. "He's not dead, Maya." Not yet. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. And with that, the wind howled again, a reminder that their fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The wind howled through the barren trees, biting and cold, but Mark barely felt it as he looked back at the river. The ice was fractured, the current churning beneath it like a hungry beast. Keen's men wouldn't follow through the ice, but that didn't mean they wouldn't keep coming. Mark's breath came in short bursts, his body aching from the cold and the battle, but his focus never wavered. Maya stood beside him, clutching her teddy bear tighter than ever, her eyes wide with fear. She was trembling, but she didn't cry anymore. She had learned to hold her tears inside, as if there was no more room for them. Ruth, still holding the baby in her arms, was watching Mark carefully, her face filled with concern, but also the deep strength that had kept her going. She had seen too much loss, too much pain, but she had held on to her faith, and now it was that faith that would carry them through. "We need to keep moving," Mark said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "The farther we get from here, the better." Ruth nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes. "But where do we go, Mark? Where do we take them?" The question hung in the air like a fog. Mark didn't know. He didn't have a plan, not really. All he knew was that he had to keep them moving, keep them alive. They couldn't stop. Not yet. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw. "But we can't stay here." Maya's voice was small, but it cut through the silence. "Is Daddy really not dead?" Mark stopped, turning to face her. The wind stung his eyes, but he didn't blink. "Maya, your dad is alive. I promise you that." But the words felt hollow in his own ears. He wasn't sure if he could keep that promise. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. Ruth laid a hand on his arm, her grip steady, but her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "We all make promises we can't always keep," she said softly, her voice a thread of warmth in the cold. "But you've kept them so far, Mark. You'll keep this one too." The words lingered in his mind as they trudged forward. There was truth in them, he knew, but the weight of it was suffocating. He couldn't be sure that Daniel, Maya's father, was still alive, that he wasn't already a casualty of the war. The trees thinned out ahead of them, revealing a narrow path leading through the woods. The ground was soft with snow and ice, the air still as if holding its breath. Mark motioned for them to follow. They moved cautiously, Maya clutching his sleeve, Ruth trailing behind with the baby in her arms. Rex was ahead of them, every step alert, his senses heightened as always. The K9's growl barely registered, but Mark caught it just in time. He stopped abruptly, signaling for everyone to be silent. Rex's ears were forward, his eyes fixed on something ahead in the trees. Mark instinctively raised his rifle, scanning the path ahead. Then he saw it. A figure, tall and cloaked in a heavy black coat, standing silently at the edge of the woods. Mark's heart dropped into his stomach. He didn't need to hear the figure speak to know who it was. "Keen, going somewhere?" Keen's voice drifted through the trees, smooth and taunting. "You think you can just run away from me?" Mark's grip on his rifle tightened. He motioned for Ruth to take Maya and the baby deeper into the woods. They needed to get as far as they could, but Mark wasn't going to let Keen take them without a fight. Keen stepped forward, his men emerging from the shadows behind him. The first soldier raised a rifle, but Keen motioned for him to lower it. "No need for that," Keen said, his voice calm and commanding. "Sergeant, we both know this is over. You've done your part. You've kept them alive long enough, but now—" He trailed off, a smile creeping onto his lips. "Now it's time for you to hand them over." Mark shook his head, the weight of Keen's words sinking into him. "I won't let you take them." "Not while I'm breathing." Keen's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "You should have stayed out of this, Sergeant. You should have stayed in the shadows like everyone else. You're out of your depth." Mark's pulse quickened. The last thing he wanted was to be caught in a standoff with Keen. He didn't have the strength for it, and he certainly didn't have enough ammunition. But there was one thing he did have: time. Time for them to get away. He turned to Ruth, his voice low but urgent. "Take Maya and Nina. Get to the river. I'll hold them off." Ruth's eyes widened. "Mark, no! I'll catch up," he promised, his voice hoarse with the effort of it. "Go." Ruth hesitated, but there was no time for argument. She nodded sharply, pulling Maya and the baby toward the trees. The K9 followed, but not without looking back at Mark one last time. As they disappeared into the forest, Mark turned his attention back to Keen. "You don't get them," Mark growled, stepping forward. "I won't let you." Keen raised an eyebrow. "And what will you do?" "Kill me?" "I don't think you have it in you. I'm not going to kill you," Mark said, his eyes locked on Keen's. "But I'll make sure you don't take another step toward them." Without another word, Mark charged, his rifle raised. The moment was brief, a blur of movement and noise. Keen's men hesitated, and that hesitation was all Mark needed. He fired, the shots echoing through the trees, knocking the first soldier off his feet. The rest scrambled to respond, but Mark was already moving, ducking behind trees, his every step calculated to buy time. But even as he fought, he could feel the weight of the promise he had made to Maya, the promise that her father wasn't dead. The question lingered in the air, a haunting whisper. "Daddy's not dead, right?" Mark didn't have an answer, not yet, but he would fight, and he would keep that promise as long as he could. Mark's heart thundered in his chest as he crouched behind the thick trunk of a tree. The snowstorm, still howling relentlessly, seemed to swallow every sound, but he knew Keen's men were closing. In he could hear their boots crunching through the snow, their voices low and taunting. "Do you really think you can outrun us?" Keen's voice was unmistakable, cutting through the storm like a blade. "We're everywhere, Sergeant." "You can't hide from me." Mark gripped his rifle, the cold steel digging into his hands, but he didn't flinch. He had no intention of hiding. He was done running. With a deep breath, he peeked out from behind the tree, scanning the snowy expanse. His eyes locked onto Keen, who stood confidently at the edge of the clearing, as though the storm didn't touch him. The man had never looked more dangerous. Mark didn't have much time. He had to make a choice, fight or flee. He looked back toward the path leading deeper into the woods, where Ruth, Maya, and the baby were hiding. They had to get across the river, but there was no way they could do that with Keen's men in pursuit. His heart clenched as he remembered Maya's words. "Daddy's not dead, right?" Mark didn't know how to answer her. He didn't know if Daniel, Maya's father, was alive, or if he ever would be again. He only knew one thing: he wasn't going to let Keen tear apart what little hope Maya had left. He heard the K9 growl in the distance, a low, deep rumble that sent a chill down his spine. Mark turned toward the sound and saw Rex charging through the snow, leaping into the fray. The dog's loyalty was undying, and Mark couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. "Good boy," Mark whispered under his breath, watching as Rex took down the nearest soldier, his sharp teeth sinking into the man's leg. The soldier screamed, but Rex didn't relent, holding him down until Mark gave the signal. "Now." Mark sprang into action, charging toward the soldiers with his rifle raised. He fired once, twice, hitting the first man in the chest, dropping him to the ground. The others scrambled to react, but Mark was already on the move, ducking behind the cover of trees and rocks, firing shots as he went. The K9 was a blur of fur and muscle, knocking over one soldier after another with ruthless precision. The dog's ferocity was unmatched, and for a brief moment Mark allowed himself to hope. But hope was fleeting. Keen's men regrouped quickly, surrounding Mark on all sides. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps as he fought back, but the numbers were too great. He was running out of ammo, and the cold seeped deeper into his bones. He had to make a choice. He glanced toward the river. Ruth, Maya, and the baby were already at the water's edge, but the current was strong, and the ice was treacherous. It was their only chance. He had to buy them time. Mark's hand shook as he reloaded his rifle, but his resolve hardened. He couldn't afford to fail them. He couldn't let Maya's father's promise die here. With a final glance toward the river, Mark turned back to face the enemy. He didn't have much time, but he had enough. "Get to the river," Mark shouted to Ruth. "I'll hold them off." Ruth hesitated, but there was no time for her to argue. She nodded sharply, her eyes filled with fear and determination, and began running toward the ice. "Go!" Mark shouted again, turning to face Keen and his men. Keen smiled coldly. "You're running out of time, Sergeant. I'll give you one last chance. Give me the girl, and I'll let the rest of you go." Mark didn't flinch. His hands were steady, his aim unwavering. "You'll never have her," he growled. Keen's smile faltered, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "You're making a mistake." "This doesn't have to be hard." "I'm not making a mistake," Mark said, his voice low but resolute. "This ends here." With that, Mark took aim, firing once more at the nearest soldier. The man fell, but more replaced him, coming at Mark from all angles. Keen's soldiers were relentless. They moved like shadows through the storm, closing in with every second. But Mark didn't retreat. He fired, reloaded, and fired again. Rex fought beside him, the dog biting and clawing at anyone who came too close. The soldier and the K9 were a force to be reckoned with. As the battle raged on, Mark's eyes never left the river. He knew he had to keep Keen's men occupied, but he also knew his time was running out. Then a scream pierced the air, a sound so pure and filled with terror that Mark's heart skipped a beat. It was Maya. Mark's heart raced as he turned to see her standing at the water's edge, her arms outstretched, her face twisted in fear. The baby, still wrapped in the green blanket, had slipped from Ruth's arms and was floating dangerously in the current. "No!" Mark shouted, his voice cracking. He sprinted toward the river, his rifle still in his hands, but his only focus was Maya. But before he could reach her, a soldier grabbed him from behind, knocking him to the ground. Mark's rifle skittered away in the snow, and for a moment everything seemed to slow down. "Daddy's not dead," Maya whispered again, her voice full of desperation. The words cut through the chaos like a blade. Mark's chest tightened as he twisted, trying to free himself from the soldier's grip. Rex was already there, tearing into the soldier's leg, forcing him to release Mark. The K9's loyalty was absolute, but it was the moment Mark had been waiting for. With a final burst of energy, Mark shoved the soldier off, grabbing his rifle and firing one last shot. The soldier fell. Mark didn't waste a second. He sprinted toward Maya, diving into the river after her. The current was strong, pulling at him, but he wouldn't let go. He couldn't. He reached Maya, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the far bank. The baby, still wrapped in the green blanket, was close by, floating just within reach. With one final push, Mark grabbed the baby and swam with all his strength toward the shore. Maya clung to him, her small arms wrapped tightly around his neck. When they reached the bank, Mark pulled himself out of the water, gasping for air. The storm still raged, but they were safe for now. Ruth was waiting at the edge, her eyes wide with relief. "You made it," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Mark nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "For now," he said, "but we have to keep moving." The sound of the river's current crashing against the jagged rocks filled the cold, but it wasn't the rush of the water that Mark focused on. It was the cold weight of the newborn in his arms and the trembling little girl beside him. Maya's small hand clung to his sleeve, her eyes wide, staring across the river as if expecting something, someone, to emerge from the mist. Mark knew she was looking for her father. He could see it in the way she searched the horizon, her tiny body shivering despite the warmth of her grip on him. She hadn't asked him again if her father was alive, but Mark could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air. Her hope, so fragile yet relentless, beat like a drum in the back of his mind. He looked back at the path they had taken through the woods. Keen's men wouldn't stop. They would never stop until they had Maya, until they had what they wanted. The only way to truly escape was to keep moving and keep her safe. But how much longer could they run? "Daddy's not dead, right?" Maya's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and desperate. Mark froze for a moment, his chest tightening. He had promised her. He had promised that her father was alive, but that promise had never felt so fragile. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I want to believe he's alive, Maya." "I do, but I can't promise you that." She looked up at him, her eyes full of silent understanding, but her face was still full of hope. It was as if the thought of losing her father was too much for her to bear, so she clung to the one piece of hope she had left. "Then we'll find him," she said simply. Mark looked at her, the strength in her voice surprising him. She had endured so much, far more than any child should, but there was something in her, something unbreakable. "We'll find him," Mark said softly, more to reassure himself than her. They continued walking, Maya's small steps matching his, her teddy bear pressed tightly against her chest. Ruth followed closely behind, cradling the baby in her arms, her eyes scanning the surroundings with caution. The woods were thick with snow and shadow, the trees groaning under the weight of the storm, but for the first time in a while there was a fragile sense of peace. They were still alive. For now. As they reached a small clearing, Mark spotted something. An old hunting cabin, half buried in snow, its door ajar. He motioned for them to stop. "We need to rest. Just for a few minutes. We can't keep going if we don't take a moment." Ruth nodded, her face etched with exhaustion, but she didn't argue. The baby was still sleeping, wrapped tightly in the green blanket, but Ruth's tired eyes spoke volumes. They made their way inside the cabin, the old wood creaking under their weight. It was sparse, but at least it offered shelter. Mark helped Maya sit in a corner, then sank down beside her, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders. Ruth set the baby down, then sat beside him. The silence stretched between them like an unspoken understanding. They had made it this far, but Mark knew it wouldn't be enough. "How much farther can we go?" Ruth asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't answer right away. He stared at the snow falling outside, his thoughts clouded with doubt. He had no answers. He didn't know where they were going or what the next step was. All he knew was that they couldn't stop. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not even for a second. He looked at Ruth, and for the first time in a long while, he saw the weariness in her eyes. It was a look he knew too well, a look that said she had given everything, and there was nothing left. "We keep moving," he said finally, his voice thick with the weight of the decision. "We don't stop until we're far away from here. I don't care if it takes days, weeks, or months. We don't stop." Ruth nodded, but there was no joy in it, only the resigned acceptance of a woman who had been fighting for far too long. "We'll find him, Mark," she said, though her voice wavered. "I know we will." Mark wasn't sure he believed that anymore, but he didn't say it aloud. Maya needed hope. Ruth needed hope. And he had to believe, if only for them. He glanced at the door again, listening intently for any sound of movement outside. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the world in silence. But that silence felt like the calm before the storm. A soft whimper from the baby pulled him from his thoughts. Ruth picked up the baby, cradling her gently, her eyes filled with love and worry. The baby's eyes fluttered open, her tiny hand reaching up to grasp Ruth's finger. Ruth smiled faintly, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I just want them to be safe," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't want them to suffer like this." Mark didn't know what to say. The world had given them nothing but hardship, and yet Ruth still clung to hope, still believed in the possibility of a future, even in the darkest of times. "You've done everything," he said quietly, "and we'll keep doing everything until we're out of this." He looked down at Maya, who had fallen asleep beside him, her teddy bear still clutched in her arms. Her face was peaceful now, but he knew it wouldn't last. She had seen too much. She had been through too much for her to stay innocent. And then the worst thought crossed his mind. What if Maya never saw her father again? What if they couldn't escape Keen's grasp? The whisper of a promise from earlier still echoed in his mind. "I'll bring you to him. I swear." But deep down, Mark wasn't sure if he could keep that promise. The weight of it was unbearable. Ruth's voice broke through his thoughts again. "Mark, what if we don't make it?" He looked at her, her eyes searching his for an answer. There was no easy answer, no promise that could guarantee their safety. "We will," he said, though his voice was laced with uncertainty. "We have to." The cabin was silent, save for the soft crackling of a fire Ruth had managed to start. The flickering light cast long shadows across the walls, creating an eerie stillness that matched the weight in Mark's chest. He hadn't realized how heavy the silence could be until now, until they were here in this tiny, broken shelter, with no clear escape and nowhere to turn. Mark stood at the window, staring out at the snowstorm that seemed to rage with even more intensity than before. His thoughts kept drifting back to Maya and the promise he had made to her father. A promise to keep her safe, to bring her to him. But how could he? He didn't even know if Daniel was alive. A soft noise from the corner caught his attention. Maya had woken up, her small body curled up on the old blankets. Her teddy bear was still clutched in her arms, and her eyes, though filled with fear, still held the quiet hope that had carried her this far. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold. He turned to face her, forcing a smile. "Hey there." "You're awake?" She nodded slowly, sitting up. "Are we safe now?" Mark's heart broke at the question. She was just a little girl, so full of innocence despite everything she had been through. She should be asking about toys or stories, not about life and death. "We're safe for now," he said, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Maya frowned. "But what about Daddy?" The question, once again, struck him like a thunderclap. Mark had spent so many days fighting to protect her, to keep her safe from the horrors outside, but now that they were here, he had nothing left to offer her except empty words. "I told you," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Daddy's not dead." But Maya didn't look convinced. She was too smart for that. Her eyes, wide and trusting, held the faintest glimmer of doubt. She had heard the stories, seen the things no child should ever see. She had learned to survive, just like Mark had, but her heart still believed in the impossible. "Promise," she whispered, holding out her teddy bear. "Promise you'll bring him back." Mark closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of her request crushing him. Could he promise her something he didn't know to be true? Could he give her hope when his own heart was filled with so many questions? "I promise," he whispered, though his voice trembled. Ruth stood up from the fire, her face drawn with worry, but her eyes filled with determination. We need to move soon, Mark. The storm isn't letting up, and they'll come for us. He nodded, though his mind was still on Maya's plea. I know. I'm just trying to figure out the best way to get us out of here. Ruth's face softened. We can't keep running forever. Eventually, we'll need to make our stand. Mark turned to face her, his gaze hardening. I'll make sure we're ready. But we can't do it alone. We need to stick together. As Ruth nodded, a sudden, sharp bark from Rex broke through the tension. The dog's low growl followed, as if something was approaching. Mark's instincts flared. They're here, he muttered. Keen's men. They've found us. The tension in the cabin grew thick. Maya's eyes widened, and she scrambled toward Mark, her tiny hands gripping his sleeve. Mark, please. Mark lifted her into his arms, trying to calm her trembling form. It's going to be okay, Maya. Stay close. Ruth grabbed the baby, holding her tightly, while Mark set Maya down beside the fire. Stay here, he said urgently. No matter what, don't move from this spot. The K9 growled again, more urgently this time. Mark could hear the crunch of boots in the snow outside, several men making their way toward the cabin. Keen had found them. There was no more running. Mark grabbed his rifle, the weight of it familiar in his hands. He checked his ammunition. He didn't have much left, but it would have to be enough. The sound of footsteps stopped just outside the door, and Mark froze. He could hear Keen's voice again, low and menacing. I know you're in there, Sergeant. There's no point hiding. Mark's grip tightened on his rifle, his thoughts racing. They couldn't stay here, not with Keen so close. Move out of the way, Keen's voice called again, louder now. I'm coming in. And when I do, the girl will be mine. You can't protect her forever. Mark's chest tightened with fury. He would protect Maya. He would do whatever it took. The door creaked open, and there he was, Keen, stepping into the cabin with his cold, calculating smile. His men flanked him, rifles trained on Mark. You can't win this, Sergeant, Keen said, his voice calm, almost patronizing. You've done your best, but it's over now. Mark didn't flinch. Not over. Not while I'm still breathing. Keen's smile widened. We'll see about that. And just like that, Mark knew the moment had arrived. There would be no more running, no more hiding. The fight for Maya's life had come down to this final stand. Mark stepped forward, his rifle raised, ready to face whatever came next. But before the first shot could be fired, Maya's voice, barely above, a whisper, broke through the tension. Please don't let them take me. Mark froze. The words struck him harder than anything Keen had said. The little girl, so full of hope, so full of trust, was pleading with him for her survival. She was asking him to be strong when he felt the weakest. Mark's heart broke as he turned toward her, his hand shaking. He gave her a small, shaky smile. I won't let them take you, Maya, he promised. I swear it. The snowstorm raged outside, but inside the cabin time seemed to stop. Mark stood there, rifle raised, his resolve hardening like iron. He wouldn't lose her. He couldn't. This was it, the moment where the soldier would sacrifice everything, where the K9 would fight with the ferocity of a warrior, and where a little girl's trust would be the thing that kept them all alive. Mark couldn't be sure of the future. But in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. He would keep his promise.